Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Jay Devine, Associate Dean in Carnegie Mellon's Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences.
Can't hear you.
I'm Jay Devine. Joel Greenhouse. I'm Associate Dean in the Carnegie Mellon's Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences. But more to the point, for today's event, I'm the Secretary of Carnegie Mellon's chapter of the Phi Beta Kappa Society and advisor for Carnegie Mellon's pre-law program. We're especially pleased not only with the strong numerical turnout for today's event, but also its diversity. Seated with you in the audience are several Carnegie Mellon students, faculty, and staff, of course, but also several CMU alumni, law students from the law schools at Duquesne and the University of Pittsburgh, members of the Pittsburgh legal community, faculty and students from some of our nearby high schools, and members of Carnegie Mellon's Phi Beta Kappa chapter, as well as the Greater Pittsburgh Phi Beta Kappa Association. So we're delighted you're all here to join us. Today's event has come together through the efforts and support of several offices and individuals, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge them. First, our sincere thanks to the Phi Beta Kappa Society and their superb office staff in Washington, D.C. Today's speaker comes to us as part of a very special program that the Society sponsors called its Visiting Scholars Program. Since 1956, this program has been offering undergraduates at colleges and universities with Phi Beta Kappa chapters the opportunity to spend time with some of America's most distinguished scholars. The purpose of the program is to contribute to the intellectual life of these campuses by making possible an exchange of ideas between the visiting scholars and the resident faculty and students. Today's event is also being sponsored by the university's annual lecture series, which is run out of the CMU Office of the Vice Provost for Education. Much like the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholars Program, this lecture series features a diverse range of lectures and performances by artists, scholars, and experts invited by Carnegie Mellon faculty, students, and staff. So our thanks to Vice Provost Amy Burkert and her staff, as well as the Dietrich College Dean's Office staff, for their invaluable assistance in planning today's event. Finally, today's event is doing triple duty as the 6th annual Thomas M. Kerr Jr. Lecture on Law in American Society. I want to acknowledge our continuing gratitude to the Kerr family for allowing us to have Tom's name and legacy associated with this annual lecture. This annual lecture reflects the expanded mission of the Carnegie Mellon pre-law program to not only serve its members who are considering law school, but also to serve as facilitator for civic engagement for the university and Pittsburgh communities in matters of law and justice that have broad relevance for us all. As you'll see from the biography of Tom Kerr that we've distributed to you, Tom's was a very full and impactful life, and particularly in areas of service. Service to his country during the Second World War as a United States Marine, as well as through his work at the U.S. Department of Justice. Service to employers in helping them understand and implement codes of ethics in their organizations and in their work. Service to his community as a champion of social justice and civil rights. Much of this last form of service connected Tom with the Pittsburgh office of the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, where Tom's name is still the stuff of legend. Because of this strong ACLU connection and the focus in today's lecture on the story of Roger Baldwin, founder of the ACLU, I reached out to our local ACLU office, particularly with the help of Julie Downs, a colleague on the faculty in Social and Decision Sciences, who is also a member of the Pittsburgh ACLU Board of Directors. She put me in touch with Michael Lueck, who I will now introduce and who will introduce today's speaker, and also moderate a question and answer session in the time left to us after the lecture. I asked Mike to share with me some career highlights that I could use in introducing him. And there's a lot to work with. Acclaimed Pittsburgh attorney in litigation areas that include medical malpractice, personal injury, product liability, and civil rights law. Recognized in several separate years as a Pennsylvania super lawyer by Pennsylvania Magazine. Past president of the prestigious Academy of Trial Lawyers of Allegheny County. Past chairperson of the Accountability, Conduct, and Ethics Commission of Allegheny County. Past president of the Pennsylvania American Civil Liberties Union. But Mike's admonition to me was to use or ignore whatever I wanted from this resume, but that I should be sure to mention one particular thing. Namely, that he was a personal and professional friend and disciple of Tom Kerr's. Of all of his honors and accomplishments, that mattered to him most in being introduced today. And so would you please join me in welcoming friend and colleague of Tom Kerr, Michael Louis, who will introduce me.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Jay. These are challenging times that we are going through, as everybody in this room, I'm sure, is well aware. And for some, the word challenging may well be an understatement. Some think our very democracy, our very institutions, our system of justice, our values are being tested like they've never been tested in our lifetime. On the other hand, for Roger Baldwin, who is largely the subject of this afternoon's lecture, what's going on today just might be another day at the office. I expect we'll get a better sense of that from today's distinguished lecturer. Speaking of distinguished, that's one of the many adjectives that applies to the professor in whose memory this lecture is named, Thomas M. Kerr, as Jay just referred to. Professor Kerr was a law school graduate, a highly decorated U.S. Marine, an antitrust prosecutor, a corporate lawyer, a civil rights lawyer, and he was a CMU professor for almost 37 years. He was a teacher of business ethics for many years before teaching business ethics became the in thing to do. He was a teacher of multiple other courses in various schools throughout the Pittsburgh area, teaching to hordes of students who universally rated him as the best teacher they ever had. He was an active member for years of the ACLU, one of the country's leading civil rights organizations dedicated to protecting civil liberties, freedoms, and the rights of all people. He served as president of the state ACLU and served on the national board of the ACLU. Because of his commitment and outspoken ACLU work, Professor Kerr came to be known throughout Pennsylvania as Mr. Civil Liberties. And he was probably an FRB, a friend of Roger Baldwin's. Professor Kerr was a civil liberties scholar and stalwart and a role model for many of us, including myself, as Jay referred to. So, I can assure you that the distinguished Professor Kerr would be thrilled and extremely honored that the distinguished Professor Witt would be with us today to speak on a subject dear to Tom Kerr's heart. Professor John Fabian Witt's background and his expertise are extraordinary. He's been teaching at Yale Law School since 2009. He's presently the Allen H. Duffy Class of 1960 Professor of Law, a special designation. He's also a professor of history. He taught at Columbia University, the University of Texas, and Harvard. He's earned multiple degrees from Yale, graduated Yale College, receiving a Bachelor of Arts degree summa cum laude, and elected a member of Phi Beta Kappa. He's a graduate of Yale Law School, where he was senior editor of the Law Journal. He obtained a PhD in history from Yale, where he received prizes for his dissertation. This man is one serious Yale bulldog. He's written a number of books, including a multiple awards-winning book on the laws of war. His book on the story of money and politics in America is soon to be published. He's written a case book on the subject of torts, a book used in many law schools, and has written many chapters in books and on a variety of topics. Likewise, he's written numerous articles and other pieces published in law journals and in other professional and academic journals. His writings often appear in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, on Slate, in the Washington Post, and on NPR. He is regularly invited to present papers and make presentations, and we're lucky to have him with us today. His interests are wide-ranging, but with a general focus, I would say, on legal history, constitutional law, tort or personal injury law, the laws of war, and on human rights. And on top of all that, to his great credit, he served on the boards of directors of a preschool and an early learning center, all those in his role as a good dad. Professor Witt's lecture topic today is The Switch, the 20th Century Reinvention of American Freedom. It is a great honor and distinction to present to all of you Professor John Fabian Witt.
It's a real honor to be here today. Thank you, Mike, for that really generous and outrageously generous introduction. I'm grateful, and Jay, thanks for presiding over these this chance to get to talk to folks at Carnegie Mellon. It's a special pleasure to be in Pittsburgh. As I was getting a chance to tell Jay and Mike, I spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh as a kid. My father's family is a Morningside, East Liberty family. I'm a little bit dim on the geography, and every Thanksgiving, I played touch football outside the Highland Park Reservoir, which I gather is in the news of late, but it's all good now, I hear, it's all good. So it's really nice to come to Pittsburgh to talk about some of the things I'm thinking about now. Also, as you'll see, I think appropriate to talk in Pittsburgh, since Pittsburgh is a place whose story runs through some of the work that I'm into right now. So it is true that we live in interesting times, and I'm going to ask you, I'm going to ask for your permission to leave these interesting times and to come with me back a century. I promise we'll find interesting times again, and then maybe we could circle back to our present interesting moment. But let's go back a century. More or less a century, to 1920, and the election of Warren Harding, which is an important election in American history. So in the Republican convention of 1920, there are a whole array of Republican candidates, many of them men of great distinction, serious candidates, and it turns out, by coincidence, accident, hook and by crook, that a candidate named Warren Harding, obviously a second-rater, happens to get the Republican nomination that year. The more prominent candidates, there are too many of them, they cancel one another out, and Harding, to everyone's surprise, becomes the nominee. He then runs in a general election against James Cox, a fellow Ohio politician, Harding from Ohio. And the Democratic nominee, James Cox, is by common consensus the superior candidate, the superior would-be administrator of the country. But the United States is in a funny mood in 1920, and it wants to reject the signature accomplishment, or would-be accomplishment, of 8 years of Democratic Party leadership, which is to say Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. And so Warren Harding, an obvious second-rater, is made president of the United States in 1920. And in Warren Harding's election lay a kind of crisis for democracy. That sort of decision-making, that sort of outcome is never good for a democracy. But in 1919 and 1920, it was much, much worse than any particular bad political outcome. And so if we think about the world of 1919 and 1920, which I'm going to invite you to follow me with over the next couple minutes, I think you'll get a sense of the crisis of the democratic order that 1920 America faced. So let's just start with the huge difficulty that the United States was experiencing during 1919, 1920 in integrating the Great Migration into the fabric of American social life. The Great Migration being the mass movement of African Americans, largely the descendants of slaves, from south to north into places like Pittsburgh, with the result being, in the summer of 1919 in particular, a whole series, dozens of race riots, many of them across the north, producing huge mayhem in African American communities and white communities across the country. Some of these are really extraordinary riots. So there are riots in the summer of 1919 in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, killing 15 people. In Chicago, some 38 people die in the summer of 1919 in a race riot. In Arkansas, there's a race riot that kills more African Americans than we can really tell. The best estimates by historians suggest something like 300 deaths in a series of race riots designed to stop black peons from organizing a sharecroppers union. Riots go on in dozens of places across the United States. It's not just race riots. We also have labor strife. And here's where Pittsburgh can come in. So 1919 and into 1920 is the period of the Great Steel Strike, which features Pittsburgh and Homestead as really the center, the epicenter of the strike. 250,000 people go out on strike in the steel strike of 1919. And 1919 into 1920, Pittsburgh and steel is not alone. Some 4 to 5 million workers go out and strike during 1919, 1920, trying to protect the wage increases that the war had brought in the face of inflation that made consumer products much more expensive. Those strikes are largely failures. The Pittsburgh steel strike is famously a failure for workers who would organize the steel mills that had essentially been non-union since the great Homestead strikes of the 1890s. The strikes are a really important part of that democratic crisis of 1919, 1920. That 4 to 5 million people represents 1 in 5 American workers. So 1 in 5 American workers is striking in 1919. But that's not all. So in 1919, 1920, the United States was trying to figure out how to integrate, how to come to terms with a massive process of immigration that has transformed what the United States looks like, has transformed by crossing borders, has changed what the United States looks like in 1920. In 1920, there are some 13 million foreign-born Americans out of a population of a little bit north of 100 million. Over the preceding 40 years, something like 25 to 30 million immigrants had arrived in the United States. Many of them from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, many of them Jewish, many of them Catholic, not the American population of 1840, let's say. This too creating a real set of crises for American democracy. Lots of talk of hyphenated Americans. Will the hyphenated Americans have the same kind of loyalty to the American project as, well, the non-hyphenated Americans? So far we have race riots, labor strife, and an immigration crisis, and panic about immigration, which many of you know is about to produce, if you're in 1920, a series of draconian limits on immigration to the United States, limits that stay in place until at least the 1960s. We've also got a terrorism scare alongside the immigration crisis, and these two things are linked together in the conversation of the 1920s. And by a terrorism scare, I mean a real terrorism scare with lots and lots of bombings. Early in the spring of 1919, several dozen bombs are found in the U.S. mails addressed to prominent Americans. Later on in the summer of 1919, bombs go off in a variety of cities, including on the doorstep of the Attorney General of the United States, Attorney General Palmer. That one kills only the man who'd been trying to lay it there, but bombings nonetheless. In 1920, a bomb goes off on Wall Street, the evidence of which you can still see if you look at the walls there along Wall Street, killing some 38 people. It's a 1920 version of a car bomb. It goes off in a horse cart. And what follows are a series of raids designed to root out the anarchists who were, in fact, bombing, and in fact espoused bombing all around the country. And the Palmer raids result in literally thousands of arrests and hundreds of deportations, including of famous characters like Emma Goldman, the prominent anarchist, and a kind of amazing all-around character, is deported in 1920 for her anarchist views. And amidst all of this tumult in American democracy, there is a U.S. Supreme Court that is essentially supremely indifferent to virtually every one of these crises. It's a Supreme Court that reads the Reconstruction constitutional amendments that have been designed to protect the freed people and then the descendants of the freed people from discrimination. But the U.S. Supreme Court in 1920 has essentially read much of the 14th Amendment out of the Constitution, at least insofar as it purports to protect the freed people and their descendants. The 14th Amendment has instead become, by 1920, a license for the protection of people and corporations with property, and a license for the enforcement of their rights to engage in free contract and the free use of their property. The Supreme Court, in its response to labor strife, is famously in 1920 an anti-labor court. In 1921, it will famously undo what labor had thought had been one of its great accomplishments in 1914, the enactment of the Clayton Act, which announced that human labor was not a commodity. The theory of this announcement was that it would make it hard for courts, for judges, to enjoin labor strikes and to issue injunctions against labor actions. And in 1921, the U.S. Supreme Court interprets that away from the Clayton Act of 1914. In response to terrorism and the crackdown on dissidents around the United States, the Supreme Court has done nothing in 1920, actually in its entire history, from 1791 and the creation of the Bill of Rights, well past 1920, the U.S. Supreme Court never once protects on First Amendment grounds the rights of a speaker. That's the product of the 1930s at the very earliest. So this is a country, a democracy, an ostensible democracy in 1920 in, I think, dire crisis. And most of all, the crisis attaches to what I want to call a crisis in how we come to know the things we know about the things we need to decide together. And it's a crisis of how we come to know the things we know. I could call this an epistemological crisis. This being Carnegie Mellon, I should use fancy words, right? This is a good place for fancy words, and I'm inclined to do that sometimes. But the point of it is not to use fancy words, but to say that the problem being identified by some of the sharpest observers of American democracy in 1920 is that different parts of our democratic culture are coming to think radically different things, not just in their opinions and their views, but about facts, about the way the world is, and that this is a crisis for democracy of the first order. One way to get a sense of this is to start with a fascinating English social critic whose name was Graham Wallas. And Graham Wallas in 1914 writes a book called The Great Society. So the Great Society is a term that Lyndon Johnson is going to pick up in the 1960s to describe a society that takes care of the kind of mass poverty, mass unemployment, mass sickness, the array of social problems that attach to modern industrial democracies. The Great Society will take care of people in Lyndon Johnson's version of it. But Graham Wallas has a more unsettling, worried version of the Great Society. So for Wallas, the Great Society is the problem of mass society, mass industrial democracies. And the difficulty for Wallas is that Wallas is convinced that human collectives have always organized themselves around irrational, non-reasoned politics. That politics is the ground of Freudian psychology and unreason, just inevitably. And that when communities are small, this is manageable. But when communities are large, and when democracy is made up of vast crowds, then the psychology of democracy becomes difficult to manage. Now, that 1914 book, The Great Society, is dedicated to a student that Wallas had at Harvard College when Wallas taught briefly at Harvard in and around 1910. The student is Walter Lippmann. And Walter Lippmann will go on to be one of the one of the great social critics and observers of 20th century American politics. And Lippmann takes Wallace's Great Society one step further. And in a book called Public Opinion, published in the early 1920s, Lippmann takes the idea of the irrational democracy, the idea of an irrational democratic order, and develops a theory of how that irrational mass might be managed and might be handled. And for Lippmann in particular, the problem of mass society is that people no longer have firsthand knowledge of the facts they need to be meaningful governors of their situations, meaningful regulators, meaningful voters, meaningful citizens in the situations they find themselves. All information comes secondhand, and that means it comes through things like the newspaper. That's the key high-tech information technology of 1920 is the newspaper. It's not such a high-tech thing by 1920, but it is the way in which information is distributed in mass democracies. And Lippmann's readings of the newspapers in a series of studies he does beginning in 1917 lead him to the conclusion that the newspapers are systematically misleading their audiences about the facts of the world, sometimes intentionally, but that's not the worst of it. That's easy to resolve. The real problem is that at secondhand, when information's at secondhand, all information comes filtered by what Lippmann called stereotypes. And by stereotypes, he just meant ideological frames. Let's just leave out ideological. Let's send ideological where epistemological went, and just say frames. All information comes framed by narratives, oftentimes narratives driven by advertisers. That is, the economic basis of the newspapers was important and interesting to people of Lippmann's generation. And this is a crisis for democracy. If information can't be relayed to the people who need to make the basic decisions about how we govern ourselves. So that's the 1920 Warren Harding moment. And I think it's a pretty dire moment in the history of American democracy. The usual story that historians tell of the 1920s is one in which questions about politics, questions about the public, questions about how we govern ourselves as a collective are recessive. There's not much constructive, effective engagement with those public questions in the 20s. Goes the usual story. There is a jazz age. There is the roaring 20s. Jay Gatsby will be doing whatever it is Jay Gatsby does. There will be lots of interesting things to talk about, but they're going to move to the private. They're going to move away from the public. And I think you now might be in a good position to see the appeal of this story. That is, the public questions being mooted about and debated in 1919, 1920 are at such a terrible place that it's easy to understand the appeal of the private and the move away from the collective. What I'd like to do here over the course of the next, I guess half hour. Can I have a half hour? Is describe a different take on the 1920s. A take in which we might see in a variety of really interesting, important things going on in the 1920s, an effort to rebuild the foundations, or what I want to call the infrastructure, the democratic infrastructure of American democracy during the course of the 1920s, such that in the 1930s, after the crash and in the crisis of the Great Depression, there is a set of institutions on which a new democratic order, the democratic order of the middle of the 20th century, which we're fast seeing disappearing in front of our eyes, I think, gets put in place. So the 1920s, I think we might think of as a place in which we see the construction of a democratic infrastructure. So what do I mean by those kinds of things? I want to talk today about 4 different domains of social life in which I think in the 1920s, in interesting ways, this democratic infrastructure was being put in place. I want to talk a little bit about the arts. The arts are a place one can go when politics is not working. And the arts are a place where there's communication among people, and in which we might actually be able to see the construction of some of the kinds of foundations on which democracy might rest. I want to talk about the American Civil Liberties Union and Roger Baldwin and the creation of a free speech tradition, which again I think is a really critical piece of the construction of modern democratic cultures. Talk a little bit about the labor movement, which, as I've said, Pittsburgh had seen crushed in 1919 and into 1920. It's, as we'll see, importantly connected to civil liberties and free speech. Those two things came together in 1920. We think of them as separate and apart now, in fact, sometimes at odds with one another in our post-World War II culture in particular. But in 1919, 1920, they run together. And then last, talk a little bit about the construction of a democratic administrative state. That is to say, the kind of bureaucratic structures which we're all too familiar with and have become all too familiar demons in our political conversations over the course of the last decades, but which in 1920 barely exist. 1920 being before the construction of the New Deal administrative state. But in the 1920s, we see lots of interesting ways in which democratic administrative state structures are put into place. So let's jump in. Arts, free speech, labor, and a democratic administrative state. In the area of the arts, the character who I've become really interested in of late is a man named James Weldon Johnson. So James Weldon Johnson is the head of the NAACP throughout most of the 1920s, and is an amazing character, is part of the Great Migration, is really at the front end of it, the Great Migration. He's born in Jacksonville, Florida. Moves to the New York area around 1899, 1900. Moves, by the way, because he's nearly lynched in Jacksonville, Florida. There are on the order of 4,000 lynchings, mostly of African-American men, 1880 to 1930. I mean, it, alongside the race riots, is one of the central crises of American democracy. And when he comes into the leadership of the NAACP at the end of the 1910s, beginning of the 1920s, Johnson, along with the NAACP leadership, makes an anti-lynching bill one of his central goals. And for the NAACP leadership, the election of Warren Harding is actually good news. I've presented it. I've been too hard on poor Warren Harding so far. But Warren Harding is, after all, a Republican, which means that in 1920 he's part of the party of Abraham Lincoln, and African Americans are part of the Republican Party coalition. James Weldon Johnson wrote editorials for the black community against Woodrow Wilson in 1916 and repeated his pro-Republican lobbying in 1920. And so with Harding's election and with a Republican Congress, the conviction in the NAACP is that an anti-lynching bill is finally available. A bill that would announce as a matter of federal law that lynchings of African Americans in the South or elsewhere, that lynchings creep into the border states and the North as well, that lynchings will be illegal as a matter of federal law, and that lynching victims won't be at the behest of white Southern officials who aren't interested in prosecuting lynching mobs. And in 1922, Johnson scores a huge success. He manages to get the House of Representatives of the United States to pass the Dyer anti-lynching bill. Representative Leonidas Dyer is a white Republican from Missouri who sponsors the bill, and the House of Representatives passes it. And that turns Johnson to the Senate, and indefatigably, he lobbies in the Senate for weeks and weeks. And then in 1922, the lion of the Senate, Senator William Borah of Idaho, the leader of the Republican Party, informs Johnson that the Senate will not pass the Dyer anti-lynching bill, and that it's the Republican senators' considered view that the United States Constitution, that 14th Amendment designed to protect the rights of the freed people, didn't give Congress the authority to protect the rights of the freed people. And so the bill fails, and Johnson is then sent into a crisis of how to engage in political leadership in this kind of a political environment of the 1920s for his community. And what Johnson does for the rest of the 20s is turn to the arts, turn to literature, music, poetry, and preside over the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. And the turn to the arts is a complicated one for Johnson. He, someone who had been in the arts for some time, in 1899, 1900, he and his brother are writing Broadway show tunes, which are hugely successful. It's interesting, it's before a moment several decades later in which it will be very difficult for African Americans to be leading writers of songs for Broadway. But in 1899, 1900, it can happen. So these aren't just shows for African American audiences, they're shows for wide audiences. And then after a long stint in the State Department, under the Republican administrations of Theodore Roosevelt and then William Howard Taft, Johnson is unceremoniously fired from the State Department, an early sign, this is 1912, 1913, an early sign that politics weren't going to work out so well in this era for African Americans. And he turns back to the arts to make a living, and he starts writing screenplays. Because in 1913, 1914, the first screenplays are coming online. He's writing screenplay shorts for an outfit called the Lubin Manufacturing Company, which is making films out of Jacksonville, Florida, Johnson's hometown. This is pre-Hollywood, you see. So Jacksonville, Florida can be a center of the film industry. It's not pre-Hollywood, but it's before the consolidation of Hollywood as the center of the American movie industry. But Johnson's engagement in screenplay writing is a difficult experience for him, because it turns out that the market for screenplays by an African-American screenplay writer is a market for minstrel shows. And so what Johnson's asked to do is produce minstrel scripts, and he does this. And he writes a screenplay called Aunt Mandy's Chicken Dinner, which features, it's a very short film. It's been lost. There are similar films that have survived. So we can see, you can YouTube these things and look around. We can see the basic structure of it, and it features blackface actors around stereotypically racist settings. And Johnson's name isn't on it. It's work for hire for the Lubin Manufacturing Company. And the NAACP in 1914 protests the film that Johnson had written. And so what Johnson encounters there in his early work in the arts after leaving the State Department is the real difficulty, the political difficulty of engaging in the arts for an African American who was interested in making equality gains for his community. And he never goes back to that minstrel tradition. Some of his Broadway show tunes had flirted with it in 1899, 1900, but he'd never been in quite as difficult a situation as that one. And then, of course, in 1915, the year after the screenplay that he produces, in 1915, the infamous film Birth of a Nation is put out. And this is an example of the arts doing great damage to some of the political causes that Johnson cared about the most. And so what Johnson does in his turn away from politics in 1922, 1923, and through the rest of the 1920s is to try to find a way to use the arts to engage audiences. And that does require sometimes engaging with some of the stereotypes. That is, you have to use the language that your audience will recognize. But then the project is to turn those literary forms, those musical forms, in directions that can make for a better story and can take your audience and move it to a better place with regard to these sorts of issues. And Johnson works hard in the arts throughout the 1920s, and in 1929, 1930, as we'll see in a few minutes, brings the successes he had in the arts and tries to bring them to bear on questions of American law, in the area of education equality. And I'm going to circle back to that in a minute or two. So what about the free speech area and the American Civil Liberties Union? So the ACLU also founded in this moment, the moment that Johnson is turning to the arts. The ACLU is founded in January of 1920. There are predecessor organizations that go back into the World War I period. And the important thing to see is that in 1920, there is no American tradition of free speech, or at least there's no American tradition of court-protected free speech. Since 1791, the basic interpretation of the US Constitution's First Amendment and its free speech clause is that all the free speech clause does is encode English law of the late 18th century into American law as a matter of constitutional obligation. And all the English law did was ban prior restraints. So it was, the First Amendment was thought to ban restraints on speech that prevented the speaker from saying something, but to do nothing to prevent the state from punishing people who had said things. The basic law was that if the thing you'd said had a bad tendency, that is, if it had, bad tendency is a term of art, that's not my, that's the doctrine. If it has a bad tendency, the state may, in its discretion, punish it. And so, during World War I, legislation like the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, this is 1917 and 1918, criminalizing a variety of different forms of dissident and anti-war and anti-draft speech are upheld by the US Supreme Court in the spring of 1919. And it's only in the fall of 1919 that we even get the first dissents from this prior restraint consensus. And so in the fall of 1919, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and Justice Brandeis will begin dissenting from the Supreme Court's decisions upholding limitations on dissenting speech. In 1920, what Roger Baldwin does, the famous Roger Baldwin founding the ACLU, is to develop a civil society organization, an institution, which will insist on civil liberties of a variety of different kinds, and in particular speech. And there are two parts of this project. One part, which I think is more familiar to us, is the defense of speakers, the defense of dissidents, the defense of people engaged in the kind of speech that is not consistent with majority view, but rather is pushing against majority views and urging something different. The less conventional piece, and I think the piece that ties more closely into Graham Wallas and Walter Lippmann, is the effort of the ACLU not just to defend speakers, but to create them. Think, for example, of the Scopes Monkey trial. So here's an ACLU-financed effort to defend academic freedom to teach evolution in Dayton, Tennessee. The Scopes Monkey trial, though, is created by the ACLU. They put an ad in the paper asking for a teacher to be willing to violate the Tennessee law. They are creating this episode in an effort to break through, now I'm going to use Lippmann's language, to break through the stereotypes that had calcified and framed political conversation in the United States, and to produce new ways to access basic facts about evolution in some cases, but other facts about a variety of different public questions on the other. And what Baldwin and the ACLU managed to do successfully is to introduce the idea of civil liberties into American politics. The phrase civil liberties had never been used before Baldwin and his colleagues during the World War I began to use it. You will occasionally find it if you test me, if you do a Google search for civil liberties in quotes right now from your phone, you'll see that you can find lots of 19th century uses of that phrase, but it's always an accident of grammar. It's because some political theorist or some politician is talking about civil liberty and religious liberty and talking about them both together, and that's 1 plus 1, my math not so good, 1 plus 1 gives you 2, that's plural, and so liberties becomes plural, but the idea of civil liberties as a project in and of itself doesn't exist until World War I. And Baldwin and his peers helped set it in motion and to produce a world in which free speech becomes one of the centerpieces of American democratic life, something it hadn't been before, at the very least, the late 1920s is the moment when the rest of the Supreme Court finally starts getting on board a little bit, that free speech project. Now, one of the ways that Baldwin and his ACLU colleagues wanted to spark new conversation to break through Lippmann's stereotypes was to provide free speech protections for a labor movement that might be able to mobilize in a variety of different ways, might be able to mobilize American democracy. The story of the labor movement for the 1920s is usually told, and not unreasonably, as a dire story of failure upon failure. In 1919, 1920, there are 5 million American labor movement members, virtually all of them in the private sector. Right? So today, our unions are largely public sector unions. That's the world we live in now. In 1919, there essentially had been no public sector unions. There's a strike by the Boston Police Force in 1919, which is the first public sector union action that I know about. And it's very controversial because it's not clear that public sector unions should exist in many people's view. So there are 5 million private sector union members at the end of the 1910s. By the end of the 1920s, population is going up, but the number of union members is going down. There are fewer than 3.5 million. So huge drop-offs across the 1920s in the American labor union world. But if we look more carefully, we can see a whole bunch of really interesting things going on in the American labor movement, efforts to break through, in particular efforts to break through a divide that had made labor organizing extremely difficult in the pre-World War I and post-World War I world. And at the heart of this problem, and we see it in the Pittsburgh Steel Strike, among other places, was the problem of unorganized African-American laborers, many of them part of this great migration from south to north, and the relationship between those laborers on the one hand and white union members on the other. And it's a famous story in American labor history, but one in which it became very difficult to insist on labor protections for white labor unions if employers had access to a reserve army of the unemployed Great Migration members. And the difficulty of integrating the white labor unions, meant that this reserve army of available employees, available strikebreakers, as it were, was a huge problem. And Roger Baldwin himself had seen this in 1917 in St. Louis, where he's a social worker before the war. And just as he's leaving St. Louis to come to New York to found organizations like that will become the ACLU, there is a huge race riot in East St. Louis, right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis proper. And it's a race riot produced by strikebreakers being used by industrial employers at the very beginning of World War I. So one of the most important things about 1920s labor organizing, even in this period in which labor union membership is being decimated, is the development of connections across racial lines and the development of theories of cross-racial organizing by a set of innovative labor organizers, people like Sidney Hillman of the American Clothing Worker, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. And Baldwin is very much a part of this world because the ACLU's free speech project is seen as part of the labor project more generally. The last domain I want to describe for you is the construction of a democratic administrative state. And when the administrative state is discussed today, it's rarely paired with the phrase democratic, with the adjective democratic, right? That is, the administrative state is thought to stand in some ways as the antithesis of lowercase d democracy. The administrative state is the domain of experts who are independent of politics, insulated from politics, that is to say, insulated from democracy, designedly so in many instances. In the 1920s, at the dawn of the administrative state, there are a variety of administrative bureaucratic institutions on the ground in the 20s. Workers' compensation statutes have just swept the country in the 1910s, creating workers' compensation bureaucracies in every state, virtually every state by the end of the 1920s. There's a Federal Trade Commission, an Interstate Commerce Commission. There are state-level rate-making bodies for railroad rates, a whole variety of administrative entities put in place. There's a predecessor to our IRS, because the federal income tax exists from 1914 forward. So administration exists, and the big question for the 1920s is how to reconcile an administrative state with the basic traditions of American constitutionalism and American democracy. And there, a really important character named Felix Frankfurter is at the heart of efforts to develop a theory of the administrative state for Graham Wallas's Great Society. And at the end of the 1920s, Frankfurter turns his attention to this problem and writes a book entitled Government in the Era of Public Opinion, which is an effort to bring the administrative state expertise he's working on to bear on the problems that Wallas and Lippmann have observed in American democratic culture. And we can see in the work of people like Frankfurter all through the 20s an effort to reconcile longstanding American democratic traditions with the new problems of administrative bureaucracy and expertise. So now here's a story of the 1920s I've told you across 4 different domains, and I've just had a chance in a very short period of time to give the briefest of sketches in the arts, in labor, the invention of civil liberties, and the construction or effort to construct a democratic administrative state, in which we could think of the 1920s as a period in which a variety of Americans turned to the project of rebuilding a democratic infrastructure for a post-crisis moment, such that when things like the Great Depression happen, when crises like World War II arrive, there are a set of institutions in place that can channel those crises in directions that are more constructive rather than less. Now, I see these democratic infrastructures put in place in the 1920s as culminating in what lawyers like to call the switch in time. That's the title of my lecture. The switch in time, which is a moment in 1937, persisting into 1939, in which the US Supreme Court, which I described for you at the outset of this lecture, as being supremely indifferent to the particular crises on the ground in 1919 and 1920, switches, turns on a dime almost, and becomes a different kind of Supreme Court. And this is the key moment is the spring of 1937, when the Supreme Court stops using the 14th Amendment as a way to prevent labor legislation and other forms of social legislation, from engaging in interference with freedom of contract or transferring or redistributing wealth. In 1937, the Supreme Court says we're going to stop using the 14th Amendment in that fashion. And then in 1939, in a case called Caroline Products, the United States Supreme Court writes what is the most important footnote of 20th century American law, footnote 5 of Caroline Products, that law students in the room will recognize it. And what footnote 5 of Caroline Products says is that American constitutional law will henceforth be democracy protecting. It'll be democracy protecting in the sense that it will take seriously the democratic institutions of lawmaking in the United States, and its project will be to protect the processes of democratic lawmaking. In some sense, I think, to protect the democratic infrastructure. And that will be the protection of the democratic infrastructure will be the license for the Supreme Court's intervention. So what does that mean? That means guaranteeing citizens, voters, the rights to free speech, to free assembly that a democracy requires. It means, alongside the New Deal coalition, protecting the rights of labor unions to picket. It means protecting racial minorities from being excluded from the political process. This New Deal switch in time, in this sense, goes to each one of the different engagements that I've described for you. It goes to the problem of the Great Migration, it goes to the problem of labor, it goes to the problem of civil liberties and free speech. And it comes at a New Deal moment in which the modern administrative state is being built. Now that 1937 to 1939 switch, to my mind, culminates in Brown against Board of Education, which I think is the iconic symbol of the mid-20th century synthesis of the American constitutional order. It's the moment in which race equality becomes, for the purpose of education, for the purpose of educating citizens, becomes the icon of mid-20th century democracy. Now, I am right now at work on a book, which I hope will come out soon. Mike guaranteed it would come out soon, so I better write faster. It's a book about a way in which a small group of people was actually connected to every one of these different projects. In the 1920s, there was a small philanthropic foundation called the American Fund for Public Service, sometimes went by the name of the Garland Fund, named after the man who gave the money to the foundation, a man named Charles Garland. And this foundation is run by Roger Baldwin, whom you've heard something about here. It has on its board James Weldon Johnson, about whom you've heard something here. It has on its board for a little while Sidney Hillman, running the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America Union, about whom you've heard a little bit here. And it has as its outside counsel Felix Frankfurter, who's advising them on a variety of different questions they have about their engagements. And their project is, and these are now their words, this is how they imagine their project, is to remake the mind of America, to engage in experiments that will liberate the minds of Americans from the shackles of old institutions, and to put in place, now my words, a new democratic infrastructure. And so throughout the 1920s, they provide seed money to organizations in civil liberties, in the arts, in labor, and sometimes even organizations experimenting with the administrative state. And their last big grant comes in 1929, 1930, when they turn to the NAACP, which Johnson is running. You'll notice some insider dealing here, which we could talk about at some length. But they turn to the NAACP and make a huge promise of initially $250,000, which is a lot of money in 1930, to finance the creation of a blueprint for what will become Brown against Board of Education, and to pay for the first generation of cases litigated toward that goal. And through the 1930s, lawyers like Thurgood Marshall, working for the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall will become a Supreme Court justice later in the century, one of the most important civil rights figures of the 20th century. The Garland Fund, with these people I've described to you today behind it, is paying Thurgood Marshall to litigate these cases into the middle of the 1930s. And in doing so, helping people like Thurgood Marshall to construct a kind of democratic infrastructure. Now there's a daunting alternative story that one could tell to how it is that mid-20th century United States' democracy gets put in place. And that would be a story, I think, that would be driven by crisis. That is to say, how do we come out of the world of 1919-20 with its dire straits? Well, we come out of it because of a crash on Wall Street and a Great Depression. We come out of it because of a cataclysmic Second World War, killing tens of millions of people around the world. That's a daunting story. That's a daunting story. It would be a much happier story if there were ways to build a democratic infrastructure to make an important difference. The thought that I want essentially to leave you with is that in this democratic infrastructure lies the difference between one way of responding to crisis and another. We know that crises like economic dislocation or war can produce terrible responses by modern societies. They can produce totalitarian responses. They can produce absolutist responses, fascist responses. We've seen that in the great societies, not now having any value judgment about those societies, but in the mass societies, I'm thinking in Wallace's terms, of the 20th and now 21st centuries. But various forms of democratic infrastructure might be able to channel those crises into more rather than less constructive directions. So the question, I think, is what kinds of democratic infrastructure might we be able to expect to come about across the course of the next decade and a half? Since Warren Harding, in my opening, is so obviously a stand-in for our current dilemma, I think we're at a moment, maybe a moment unlike any since 1920, maybe unlike any since 1920, in which no matter what your view of the current order of things is, I think there should be widespread agreement that democratic self-government is in danger of being badly broken. That is to say, if you're of the view, if you're of the view that Obamacare is a disaster, it should worry you about the prospects of self-government, that there are so many others who think it's a great advance. If you're of the view that there were more people at an inauguration than ever before, it should worry you that there are others who think there were fewer than ever before. That is a crisis of democratic self-government. The inability to have agreement on basic facts that we can talk about, such that the fake news problem is Walter Lippmann's problem of stereotypes and framing. And we face now, I think, a crisis on the order of 1920. And the question of what kind of democratic infrastructure we can put in place to allow conversations to happen, regardless of the outcome of future elections, such that we're able to have constructive elections producing meaningful democratic results. So that's the question. And I don't know that I have an answer for you there. That's why being in history right now is an easier place for a lot of people. We might look to the world. And here's what I'll really leave you with is a challenge. What things are going to be put in place over the course of the next 2 decades that are going to replicate or do some of the work of the democratic infrastructure of the 1920s that paid off in the mid-20th century's democratic government in the United States. Democratic meaning lowercase d, indifferent to the particular partisan outcome. What are the things now that might do that? And I'm not sure that I understand yet. Maybe church membership. Maybe evangelical churches. We think about what's distinctive about our culture now. Many more church members as a percentage of population today than 100 years ago. So maybe that's one of the places where democratic infrastructure might be built. Maybe public employee unions, since there aren't private sector unions, maybe public employee unions are one of those places. They certainly weren't 100 years ago. So they're going to be different. But one hopes that we'll be able to find them. I'm happy to take questions, discuss, but thank you very much for listening. Great, yeah, sure. Thoughts, questions? Candidates? Yeah.
Hey, John, good to see you again. I was a fellow at Harvard when you were a visiting professor there.
Good to see you.
Absolutely. So I've got another story from the 1920s, and forgive me for hawking my forthcoming book, Prohibition.
Yeah.
So you talk about civil liberties and sort of the retreat from civil liberties in the public sphere. But what's really interesting, Prohibition actually prompted state courts, one after another, to adopt the exclusionary rule for limiting police. And then you had at the end of the 1920s, the Wickersham Commission scathing report on interrogation. So I wonder how that ties into your story, because it seems like we actually do have a very public sphere engagement with civil liberties in the 1920s because of prohibition.
It's great. I would think of that as part of the story of the construction of a rational administrative state. That is to say, one of the things that we could think of criminal justice as a part of the administrative state. We really ought to. Police departments, prosecutors' offices, the Justice Department are administrative entities, much like the rest of the administrative state. And this might be one of the stories of the engagement between the development of a modern, here, criminal justice administration on the one hand, with the problems that mass society brings along with it on the other. So I think this is an important part of the story. With the Wickersham Commission being, I like this idea, really an important marker of a certain kind of the imposition of rationality and democratic accountability of a variety of kinds. And Frankfurt, of course, is engaged all through the 20s in thinking about criminal justice in just this way. So that's a good piece of it. It's hard to talk about the 1920s and not talk about prohibition. Historians are very good at it, mysteriously, but it's such a huge part of the period. It should be part of the story. Thanks. Yeah.
Where do you think the Sacco and Vanzetti case fits in all this story?
That's great. So this foundation, the Garland Fund, provides much of the financing for the defense of Sacco and Vanzetti through the decades. So Sacco and Vanzetti actually, I'm sort of interested. How long does the legend of Sacco and Vanzetti go? Do people know who Sacco and Vanzetti are? Is this like, if you know Sacco and Vanzetti hands, okay, so that's, I think the Galleanist anarchists of the 1910s would be proud that they've had this kind of long-term effect. So Sacco and Vanzetti are anarchists who are arrested and charged and convicted and eventually executed for the murder of a paymaster outside a Boston area shoe factory. And through the 1920s, the idea that their conviction was wrongful is one of the principal cause célèbres of the American left and of American liberals. Felix Frankfurter gets deeply involved. Frankfurter not so much convinced of their innocence, but rather that the trial, in some sense another form of the state, that is, that the trial had been irrational, it had been a frame, they were framed and it was a setup. The trial was a joke, is Frankfurter's view. Frankfurter doesn't have to have a view about whether they're innocent or not to think this. You could be guilty and be in a kangaroo court. Those things could happen. So this group is really involved in that. And I think it's I would think of Sacco and Vanzetti as a little bit like the Scopes monkey trial in the sense that it's a number of happens to be liberals in these cases, identifying a flashpoint in the politics of the moment that can be an organizing node, a space for organizing and mobilizing popular critique, democratic critique of the state. The people like Baldwin become convinced by the end of the 20s that Sacco may have been innocent, but Vanzetti really wasn't. Or maybe I think I got it backwards. Sacco, I can never. One of them may have been innocent, but the other really wasn't. It is certainly true that both of them would have done it had they had the opportunity. We know that this is just the kind of thing they believed in, was appropriating the wealth of the producing classes, even if it meant death and mayhem. So they're deeply involved in it. I think it's because it's an opportunity for organizing. And one of the last thing to say about this, it shows a little bit the big tent of civil liberties. That is to say, by talking about the civil liberties crisis involved in Sacco and Vanzetti, rather than talking about whether they did it or not, you can organize a wider swath of people. You can get a Harvard law professor named Felix Frankfurter involved in defending these two anarchists who have views that are really difficult to defend in mainstream democratic politics. But the fact that they're railroaded becomes a rallying cry that you can bring people together around. So I hope that's responsive. More thoughts?
Okay.
I've talked them into submission.
You have.
I don't know how democratic that is. Wait, there's one more question. We have time for one more? Yeah.
One more question.
It's more of a reflection on what you said on what I see as an methodological approach as a historian, which is that it's easy for us to look at big disasters happening and crashing through the media and keep our eyes focused on that. But you're showing that there's there's a whole other narrative going on that people don't know so much about, that's absolutely critical to understanding this period in the longer term. So it might suggest that we who listen to you start trying to think of things that may not be on the front page, but that may be happening at another more concealed level. I don't mean conspiracy concealed, but less publicized level that might provide, again, antidotes or a response to these crashing, excessively reported disaster things that are all around us. So I think it was really wonderful methodologically how you set this up. And I think it's instructive.
Thank you. The one possible model for thinking about this in the history literature is a book that every graduate student in the 1990s had to read by Elizabeth Cohen, now a distinguished professor at Harvard, who wrote about exactly the same time period I just described to you. Right? That is 1919 to the arrival of the New Deal. And Cohen's question is a beautifully set up question. I don't know if they're history people, history students looking for a question. Her question is, why do the strikes fail in 1919 and succeed in the 1930s? And what changes? That's her question. And her answer comes from things like consumer culture, from which bring people together, oftentimes across these racial lines that I described, and constitute new political coalitions. But almost by accident in her story. That is to say, it's not about political mobilization by self-conscious actors. It's the fact that we're all shopping at the Woolworths now, or the fact that we're seeing films not in tightly bound neighborhood settings, but in larger theaters where we're sitting together. Poles with the Irish, with the Italians, creating new bases for labor solidarity. I raise this because the story I want to tell is one of self-conscious mobilization. That is, these are efforts to build a democratic infrastructure, which isn't just a byproduct or an accident. It's on purpose. Yeah.
Quick question building on that. I think one of the things that we see now is that people are fracturing back into smaller groups after kind of coming together because of the war and a variety of other things. I'm curious. As we see this this splintering, people don't really want to know what's going on in other circles again. So I'm wondering, is that something that we see like historically? Is there a trend where you see people sort of bouncing apart and then coming back together? Like, can you imagine a moment where the left will abandon The Nation and the right will abandon Breitbart and will kind of come and read the same things or go to the same
The Lions, the Lambs, lying down.
Whatever the case may be. I mean, is there? I'm just like looking for something out of history that suggests that we're not in that different of a place than we have been in the past.
That's the suggestion, right? Is that we're not in that different a place than we've been in the past. I mean, there are some big structural differences which are worrisome, which is to say the power of the American state. Globally and locally, vastly in excess of what it was in 1920. I mean, that is the capacity of the United States to do ill in the world, I mean, is unbelievably huge now. In a way that in 1920, I mean, a United States that runs amok in 1920, it's not going to be the end of the world. So that's worrisome. But yeah, the idea is that is precisely that we've seen something like this before. One thing that I've taken to doing is every day I try to read some media source that doesn't align with my political views at all. Like, I mean, I switch them around every day, but I want to have some facts every day that came from a different place. And actually, you learn a ton, you come to have, I hope have better understanding of the nature of any given problem. But I recommend you just experiment with it. It's kind of wacky. It can be maddening sometimes. You have to do it the right way. But
But do we see that happening in the past where people kind of spread off into their own media worlds and then come back to some established, the big three networks? And what is it? I mean, is it the war? Is it World War II that brings people back together for some period of time? I mean, what's the process of?
Well, so how about that? I guess the model that I've tried to describe here is one in which It's a mix of pressure from outside events that causes people to reevaluate. So that would be the Great Depression, World War II, but also a product of the availability of something to turn to. That is, there has to be some infrastructure there to turn to in those moments. And there have been, and things like labor unions provided not just a way to increase wages. Set aside the economic function of a labor union for a minute now, which is controversial and we can have a long discussion of, but they connected lots and lots of people to things with stakes and created a kind of political infrastructure that was available when crisis would strike. And I think the political function of labor unions, not as a partisan for any one particular political party, is salient now in a way that it hasn't been in a long time.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Then we're going to have to
Okay,
wrap
all
this
right.
up.
We can keep talking.